So welcome back. Move on to the main panel discussion, connecting digital partnership in the Indo-Pacific region. And please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Eva Pasova. He's in Brussels, but he's the Japan chair. That's why half we are connected, okay? To the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategies, Brussels School of Governance, and Virgil University, Brussels. And I have a long CV. She said, Sam, you better cut short. And she has served with the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, French Prime Minister Office, the OECD, and Asian Europe Foundation. Her research centers on security in the Indo-Pacific. Welcome home.
Welcome home. Thank you very much, Sam.
And with a focus on maritime security, regional cooperation, and the EU role as a global security actor. Now, as she's the moderator, I think my time is sit there. Eva, all yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sam. You can sit down. Great pleasure to be here. I mean, we've heard a lot about digital partnerships and technologies, and we're being the political scientists of the InPace project. So we're trying to promote the policy dialogue, but we always make sure that there's to inject some geopolitics into the discussions, right? So we thought that there's nothing better to wake you up at the end of the session is to spice up the technology talk with a little bit of geopolitical talk. Because, of course, these digital partnerships do not happen in a vacuum, right? We've been talking about how important it is to drive innovation, competitiveness, prosperity, and all that. But on the other side of the things, these partnerships are anchored in a geopolitical reality, which is the one of today, which is, whether we like it or not, defined by the great power strategic rivalry. And these new technologies that we talk about, that we encourage research on and innovation, are often dual-use technologies. And they are the ones that are being highly sought after by the great powers. So we live in a times where who and how you partner with matters as much, if not more sometimes, than on what you are partnering with. The topic of this discussion particularly is about connecting digital partnerships. And it follows on what Ambassador Artis was referring to, which is the latest EU digital strategy. And it's called the International Digital Strategy. Here comes the spoiler, because the emphasis is on the international side, right? Yes, there is a lot of emphasis on digital security. Europe, you probably read the news, we are suffering cyber attacks left, right, and center. There is a lot of emphasis about promoting governance, and this will be, I think, one big added value, perhaps, of the Europeans on the global scheme of things. But the biggest, really, emphasis is the international part. It is to connect the existing partnerships. So let's recapitulate. That's also what the InPace project is about. The EU has digital partnerships with Japan, with Korea, with Singapore. And treats about digital technologies through the TTC with India. Now the question is how to expand it, how to connect the existing, and kind of try to build, I don't know, I don't want to call it a digital alliance, because that's a tricky word these days. But really, these are the big questions. And so that's why we're here today, and I'm happy I don't have to answer all these questions by myself. We try to cover the ground geographically, and actually gender-wise, we're doing pretty good as well. So we have a European perspective with Professor Raluca Cernatoni, who is my partner in crime in InPace. Raluca is Professor of European Security and Defense at the Brussels School of Governance, but she's also a fellow at the Carnegie Europe, focusing on EDT, emerging disruptive technologies, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, you name it. Then to my left, Professor Benjamin Ang, who is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, where he heads the Center of Excellence for National Security, the SAN Center, and oversees future issues in technology, and heads the digital impact research. And honestly, yeah, I will not go through the biography in its entirety. It's a very impressive curriculum. Last but not least, Kartik Nachiappan, who has been our contact point for India, so this is not the first time. He's part of the InPace project. He's research fellow here at NUS at the Institute of South Asian Studies, focusing on India's geoeconomics, geopolitics, and technology. Kartik has also been working a lot on the EU-India side of things, so he's familiar with the EU approach. And I will not introduce Valentina Ivanova, whom you just heard, but Valentina has kindly agreed to sit with us and eventually chip in the discussion later on, if that's okay. So let me start with Raluca, so that we kind of, in the storytelling side of things, see why, right? So why is Europe engaging to the region? What is really the driver, and what has it got to offer? We heard about the AI side, but what's the strategic kind of purpose of it?
Great, thank you so much, Eva. Of course, 10 minutes to answer all three questions will be a high order, but I'll try to give a sort of a punchline or a pitch for today's conversation. And I was thinking actually this afternoon, what would be the punchline? And for me would be wiring trust in the digital decade or the digital century. But then, because Eva kindly also read my bio and security was everywhere, I would say as well wiring security in the digital century at the same time. And sometimes these two objectives can be quite paradoxical, contradictory, but I think that the EU manages to square the circle. So that's my punchline for this afternoon when it comes to emerging and disruptive technologies, all the buzzwords. I call them buzzwords because, of course, I'm not a STEM expert. I'm more of a social scientist, but for me, they are very important. They define, indeed, the digital century, and they have become, let's say, instruments of great power competition, as Eva has already mentioned, but also currency for power and power projection. So it comes as no surprise that in recent years, and to answer your first question about the rationale behind Europe's growing engagement in different regions around the world, including the Indo-Pacific, is exactly the geopolitical landscape. And against this geopolitical landscape, we have seen that the EU has, in the last couple of years, learning fast to think geopolitically and to think strategically. In this equation, it's not the puzzle, it's in this equation, I think digital policy becomes a very important tool. Tool in that sense, in terms of both investing in capacity and capacity building at home, but at the same time in terms of engaging and risk managing the geopolitical pressures together with partners, like-minded partners, strategic partners. So to put kind of another punchline around the digital policy or the technological policy, in recent years, I would argue that technology and geopolitics have been fusing, and in this regard, the EU has been pursuing what I would call an open strategic autonomy approach, building a strategic autonomy at home in critical technological domain, dual-use technological domains, as Eva has mentioned, including artificial intelligence for that matter, but also open at the same time in pursuing collaboration, trade, research and innovation, science, diplomacy, openness. So again, squaring the circle between maintaining that form of openness, but at the same time, building capacity at home, both when it comes to economic security, innovation, but at the same time when it comes to the more strategic dimensions that are closer to my heart, especially the military domain or hard security. So to kind of answer in short, the rationale is driven by strategic drivers. One of them is the fact that we need in Europe, but also globally, to build trusted and rules-based digital technological governance, and that can be only pursued through partnerships. And this is all more obvious because of the geopolitical landscape, so I'm again returning to that. Another strategic driver for me that is very important is diversification of technological dependencies, and I think that's also obvious in terms of seeing how certain and weaponized interdependencies, supply chains, trade are becoming increasingly weaponized, including innovation for that matter, and instrumentalized by different actors. So this was made obvious by the pandemic, but more and more recently as well by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So these have, let's say, levers or strategic drivers have showcased where vulnerabilities are, from space to under the sea, from satellites to connectivity to cloud infrastructure to undersea cables. We see an increase of the threat landscape being expanded in the cyber-physical domain. And this is also when it comes to, for instance, supply chains and trade and economic cooperation for that matter. And the third strategic driver for me that is again very, very important, and this is where I think the squaring the circle comes into play, is the pursuit of open, secure, and resilient digital corridors. And here, indeed, the digital partnerships with Singapore, with South Korea, with Japan, and the Trade and Technology Council with India are important, again, levers to bring, let's say, the international in the digital strategy and connecting the dots or the connecting network dimension of all of these initiatives, the digital partnerships. Another layer that is more technological when it comes to open, secure, and resilient digital corridors is prioritizing connectivity infrastructure, from undersea cables again, to cloud systems, to AI systems, to future generation networks, quantum technologies, all the usual suspects, satellite networks. And of course, these are a prerequisite for anchoring secure data flows, for instance, and cooperation across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. This brings me to my second point now. What is actually Europe bringing to the table? And here I thought again about three, let's say, entry points that I think are super important: regulatory trust, industrial complementarity, and financial credibility. And I think that all of three angles are quite important to unpack, because when it comes to regulatory trust, we have already heard how important is a human-centric approach, trustworthy and safe approach to the innovation and deployment of emerging and disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence. And I think that the EU has been a leader, a first mover in translating some of these norms and values into, again, policies around privacy, around accountability, around safety. And I think human oversight, all of these keywords might seem quite big words, but at the end of the day, Europe has been a regulatory first mover on many fronts when it comes to new technologies. When it comes to industrial complementarity, Europe's advanced research and innovation ecosystems, we saw those as well when it comes to AI safety, quantum technologies, advanced semiconductors, can again complement more broadly the Indo-Pacific manufacturing and scaling and innovation capacity. So I think there are lots of lucrative opportunities here for collaboration and synergy. And the final point is financial credibility. And we already heard the program that was described, and I think it's a very important program, Horizon Europe and other Team Europe initiatives. And I think that here again, the EU has been leading in terms of mobilizing both public and private investments for sustainable digital innovation and infrastructure. Maybe to, again, zoom out a little bit when it comes to the EU's perspective on these types of new technologies and also the network of trusted partners that it aims to build. For me, one of the key takeaways, and more, this is more my think tanker in me, I assess all of these digital partnerships as being modular and deliberately modular. So they are not one-size-fits-all types of agreements. They are flexible frameworks that actually allow different countries to cooperate with the EU on different policy areas and also technological areas, from, again, cybersecurity to data protection to AI to digital skills. We will discuss that tomorrow as well. So there are countless ways to look at some of these frameworks and which areas can be prioritized. And of course, for me, to highlight out of the digital partnerships, the EU-Singapore digital partnership, and we will discuss this as well more in depth tomorrow during the closed-door policy session. I think for for me, it serves as a pathfinder for, again, a value-driven, a value-based approach to some of the innovation capacities in areas like AI, for safe and trust for the AI. And also, in that sense, to complement the regulatory approach that the EU has been putting forward in these areas through an innovation and experimentation-driven approach. And I think that also on the EU side, there is a lot to learn from the wealth of experience as a new First Nation, Singapore as a new First Nation, when it comes to best practices, again, in these domains. So for me, all of these digital partnerships on their own are modular, not, very much flexible, and offer a lot of opportunities for the partners to engage bilaterally. But more importantly, I think if you look at it more holistically, the key here is indeed connecting these digital partnerships. And I think that through connecting these digital partnerships, other partners can join in and pitch in. So that's kind of the multiplier effect of some of these partnerships. So to kind of wrap up and look towards the future, three promising directions that I see coming out of the digital partnerships. First, I mentioned connecting through norms and regulatory alignment, or coordination, I call it. Second, connecting through regional hubs and test beds, so very pragmatic kind of pilot projects as well, very pragmatic initiatives. We heard as well about the potential to cooperate on innovation and regulation sandboxes. That might be a good opportunity. And the final point, looking towards the future, is connecting through capacity building and resilience. And these also span areas from cyber, but also hybrid threats. We had a chat before the panel, all sorts of things, cyber diplomacy, 5G. The EU has been also spearheading a lot of work under its own toolboxes in these areas. So to wrap up, final point, trust is the currency of power nowadays, not technology. And I think that should be prioritized first and foremost, especially among partners. Thank you.
So excellent. Honestly, I wouldn't, I'm not even trying to summarize it, but trust is a key word. You mentioned the importance of open, secure, resilient digital corridors. I believe the EU-Singapore the bilateral digital partnership is one such corridor. How can we expand that into a highway, or how can we connect it into a major regional hub is another question that we'll be also discussing tomorrow. But turning now to Ben, I mean, Singapore really has always stood out as the kind of major global hub for new technologies. Isn't Europe a little bit of a junior partner here in a way? Or we sometimes, when we talk with our Korean or Japanese colleagues, it's like, we're so advanced, why would we cooperate with Europe? But what is the Singaporean perspective? What's in it for Singapore, and what are the kind of main priorities today?
Thanks for the question, and Eva, and thanks also. Thank the organizers for inviting me to this. And thank you, Raluca, for really mapping out the whole picture. I think that one of the key points I want to draw from there is that trust is really fundamental to this. And Singapore has always wanted to be a neutral and trusted partner in this region to all of the rest of the region, and to also look for other trusted partners. And that is somewhere where the EU is actually a great potential. The consistency, the reliability, and the stability of the EU in terms of development and in terms of governance is actually very attractive in terms of how we're going forward, especially in this very unstable kind of geopolitical situation we are in. Because if we look back 10 years ago, we could understand where the US was, where the China was, but today that is a very different situation. All the trade relationships that you would have had with the US, all the digital relationships you had with the US are not necessarily what they were 10 years ago. Even just something as straightforward as the large platforms, which are the key drivers of transformation, their relationship, they used to be governable of a sort, not perfectly, but with the new US administration, they have now taken on a life of their own. They have dismissed their fact checkers and their trust and safety, and legislation was almost passed to prevent any rules being made to govern AI. So you can see that in this very unpredictable world, if I talk about three priorities that I see Singapore as having, then the EU has a key role to play in these. So number one is the neutral and trusted partner. And there we can see that, in all the arrangements and trade arrangements or digital transformation arrangements that Singapore has had, there always has been that question of not wanting to take a side on the US or China part of the great power competition, but instead being able to do business with everybody, to cooperate with everybody, and the EU as a very strong trading partner and also a digital transformation partner is actually very key to this relationship. And to be able to understand that, yes, we can understand what the EU is planning to do next. It's not, you don't have 0% tariff, then 100% tariff the next day, then 0% the next day again. The second one is collaboration. Because we've always known in Singapore that we are small, we need to cooperate with all our friends in the region and beyond. And collaboration is something that EU does well. The fact that you can pull together so many diverse countries with different thoughts and plans and priorities and even way of thinking is something that is very positive and something that we can really connect with. So the EU-Singapore Digital Trade Agreement, I think, is something that can really grow from that, because it is very consistent with all the other plans that Singapore and other ASEAN countries have to develop digital transformation as the way towards prosperity for our whole region. So the second point on collaboration, I think, is a key point, that we can, and a trusted collaboration partner. Some of the collaborations that we have had in the past with the two big competing countries, shall we say, are now in flux, because for one of the countries, the big powers, they have some of their projects, even their R&D funding has disappeared. They've been pulled. Or with the other one, any collaboration with the other one is treated by the other as a sign of being with the enemy, so to speak. So this is not a positive situation, because we want to be able to collaborate and get the best of all relationships. So the EU also, as a relatively neutral entity, is a good partner to collaborate with. The third point would be Singapore has always wanted the rules-based international order, especially in the digital space. Just example of that, chairing the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on cyber norms and rules in cyberspace. So having been involved in that process for the past 5 years, we are, many times over the past 5 years, people ask, why is Singapore trying to do something in the developing rules of cyberspace? That we understand as a small nation that without rule of law internationally, small states like us get eaten by big states. So rule of law is so important, and we see in the EU a kindred spirit of understanding and respecting the rule of law, not ruling by fiat or executive action as some have chosen to, or whether autocratic or not, the autocratic in different ways. So I think in these three things, whether it's the trust and the collaboration and the respect for rules, the development, understanding that it is not just laws and regulation, but also developing norms or behavior that actually guide day to day. You may not be able to agree on the details of a law, but definitely you can agree on a norm of behavior, and also on technical standards. Because as I serve on the technical committee for the AI standards, there's a lot that can be achieved when we actually get together and understand, oh yes, we need this technical standard so that the systems are secure and safe. And before we get to the lawmaking and everything, so these three things, I think collaboration with the EU is going to be really beneficial both ways.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. Frankly, on the front of ASEAN as well, I mean, we keep talking about the bilateral EU-Singapore digital partnership as a pathfinder to engaging with ASEAN, and of course in line also with the ASEAN Master Plan on connectivity, etc. So I think this is, I mean, the rationale is there, and it's all on a good track, thanks to also our colleagues at the official levels. You mentioned governance. Raluca mentioned that, of course, you know, any sort of global governance can only happen to partnerships and cooperation. So which brings me to kind of expanding more. Japan, Korea also share this commitment. Where does India fit in, and not just on the regulation? Of course, there is no digital partnership agreement. There's the Trade and Technology Council. How does that kind of, you know, differ? And I will get back on the regulatory side afterwards in the second round, just to. But I would now like to pass the floor to Kartik to kind of bring in the Indian perspective. So, is it somewhat similar to what Ben was talking about from the Singaporean side, or what are the main differences, basically?
Well, thank you, Eva. It's great to be here. It's great to be part of another in-pace discussion. It's a little different than what Ben was talking about with Singapore. I think kind of the biggest difference when you're thinking about India and technology relative to Singapore and the partnerships that the EU has crafted with Japan, Korea, is that the TTC is fundamentally a geopolitical instrument, right? And it is, since the get-go, it's been regarded as a geopolitical instrument, and not necessarily as something that is driven internally and functionally by the technology-focused developments in Japan, Korea, and Europe, right? So here, there's probably a much more governance angle to it, to coordinate rules, to coordinate standards, to think through how we can create a sort of a common rules-based approach of regulating these strategic and critical technologies. I think in the Indian case is different because it starts off from a completely different perch, right? And the focus there has been geopolitical. It is how do we, given the importance of technology to India's own foreign policy, its diplomacy and its grand strategy, how can we craft partnerships with countries that also expands our strategic space, if I may put it that way, how it expands our strategic autonomy in dealing with our risks and threats, right? So technology in that sense is a means to an end. And in that sense, I mean, the end is obviously advancing India's growth, its economic modernization, its digital transformation, that's one. Second, it's reducing India's dependence on some of these core technologies. It's also building India's sovereign capabilities in areas like AI, cybersecurity, quantum, space, and also enabling India to use technology for different strategic purposes, right? And you're seeing that diplomatically by the export of the India stack across the developing world. So in that sense, how does the EU fit into some of these plans that India has, and which are largely instrumental and strategic, central to its foreign policy and central to its grand strategy? And it's no surprise that in this context, India prioritizes partners with whom it has a deep strategic relationship. So the US is the most important partner, right? It's the most important partner on the defense tech side, but increasingly also on the civilian technology side, on areas like AI, telecom, space, research and development, across all critical emerging technologies. There is no substitute for the United States for India. And you see deep tech collaboration across industry as well, right? Another partner in that sense is Japan. There's a lot of funding, there's a lot of capital, there's a lot of semiconductor engagement between India and Japan, again, which enables India to build out its own fabs and its own semiconductor ecosystem. Below that, I would say some of the other partners that have become increasingly important are the Gulf countries, which provide a lot of capital to drive the internal technology development in India and help build out some of these capabilities. And I would add, alongside the Gulf is Singapore. Again, it's playing a similar function as a source of capital and as a source of technology, as a source of expertise, and where a lot can happen through bilateral cooperation. And the Gulf and Singapore also enables India to expand some of its own internal technology solutions within the Middle East and Southeast Asia, right? So again, there's a broader diplomatic strategic element that's tied here to how India engages on tech and tech policy. And I think there is mutual interest from some of these other partners. I forgot Europe, I didn't mention Europe, but Europe comes in the sense, okay, how do we figure out the best way to regulate the effects of these core technologies, right? And if you look at from data to cyber to now AI, the EU's initiatives, its regulations have been a source of inspiration on how India should think through what's the best way it's going to deal with the challenges posed by some of these technologies. And increasingly, before the TTC, that was the role that Europe has been playing. And I think that's really an important part of EU-India engagement on the tech space. I think going forward, if you kind of let me just expand a little bit, I think the focus now has to be more toward how do we operationalize some of these projects, right? Especially across the EU-India front. There's a lot of diplomacy, there's a lot of working groups, there's been a lot of discussions, but how can we think through at least coming up with some concrete initiatives on projects, things like data spaces, or things like working together to create supply chains on some of these issues, harmonizing standards, building interoperability. How do we move forward in terms of manifesting what both partners want to do, but have struggled to do for various reasons, some of which I've already talked about. So maybe I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kartik. We have started really late, so we only have about 20 minutes, including for the Q&A. So I will just ask one question to all of you. Now I'm bringing it back to regulation because I'm trying to, as you were all talking, trying to kind of distinguish that one thing that can really kind of bring us together, right? We have all common partners. We have maybe not necessarily the same interests in the first place, but kind of a long-term objectives that are aligned. Where would you see, if you had recommendations, and some of you already mentioned some, where would you see the kind of lowest hanging fruit in terms of kind of trying to network these partnerships? So one thing that comes to mind is AI regulation, AI governance, part of those, multilateral processes, Hiroshima process, whatever. Ben, you mentioned the open-ended working group on cybersecurity. What are perhaps some of the starting points, the kind of international level where we can get the discussion going? Should we go for some sort of mini-lateral alliance on some of those issues, or shall we just bring the discussions from the UN, would be probably, or OECD, or in some countries? I don't know. And I will perhaps start with Valentina. You mentioned also some of the EU regulatory potential. So where would you, on AI, would you see some sort of more international alignment on AI governance?
Actually, to be able to do something, everything happens through projects. And one of the ways to do projects also, there are the PPP, these private-public partnerships, which they work with the Commission, with European Commission, like ADRA, it's AI, Data, Robotics Association, and it's a partnership also. They can influence, or I'm in the board in Made in Europe. It's also a partnership which is discussing with the European Commission the next call for the work programs, which are devoted to some key technologies, key products that should be there. And that in being in these partnerships, there is process for planet. It's a lot of influencing also what is happening in India. There was a special program for recycling of plastics. Because if we protect only Europe, it's useless. We have to protect planet. So I see like that through these partnerships, we can influence the European Commission with upcoming calls for proposals that we can have these collaborations with Asia, with the countries included in IMPACE, for example, and that we can work together, taking into the account all our highlights which we develop in Europe and in Asia, and go moving innovation further. That's my vision.
So starting small. Starting small, building trust, and eventually expanding further. I'm sure, I'm thinking even, ASEAN connectivity, the things we can do with Japan, that Japan already does in Southeast Asia, that Europeans have been doing, and connecting some of those dots can be very valuable. Thank you so much.
For example, in spring, there are some colleagues from Czech Republic here. We were in India, in Jaipur. There was inaugurated in Institute on AI and Robotics for Healthcare, and under the supervision of Professor Magic from Czech Republic. And there were a lot of other colleagues from Europe with working with funding agency, it's okay, it's inaugurated, it's a very nice institute, very advanced, but now it should turn. And that's also something to think in the future, how it could be involved in European projects. No, just speaking, it doesn't happen anything. I can promise you everything.
That's true, absolutely. Thank you. Reluka, do you want to?
Okay.
Or you can, of course, react to something.
Yes. I was thinking, also inspired by the previous comments, what is digital diplomacy à la European style. And for me, the three keywords were, of course, technology in this sense. That's key, indeed. We heard how important it is to innovate in these technologies. Then competitiveness. I think that's very important. And the third point for me would be ethical governance. We can call it value-driven, human-centric, safe, trustworthy, or all of these words. But then the way in which I think you can do statecraft and diplomacy nowadays, you can do it by both connecting the competitiveness pillar with the ethical governance pillar. And one domain that I would prioritize is already, I think, quite advanced in the discussions at the international, regional level, minilateral level, bilateral level, but also public-private level, is trustworthy artificial intelligence. And you already mentioned some of these fora, international fora. We have the Hiroshima AI process, UN high-level AI advisory body. We have OECD initiatives, all sorts of summits, more, let's say, broader when it comes to their discussions on AI, but also nowadays we have responsible military AI discussions as well. So for me, I think that's a good starting point. Discussing about safe AI, because I see artificial intelligence as a potential disruptor from, again, the cyberspace to the physical environment, but also across all sectors. And these sectors, of course, can offer a good story for economic progress, for innovation, and, of course, for resilient and thriving societies. And some of these technologies should, of course, serve the public good. And I think that's the key in terms of pursuing these types of collaborations, because at the end of the day, we want to safeguard AI potentially disruptive future and also to reap the benefits of that innovation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ben, would you like to add anything or react?
I agree with what Raluca has said, and also thanks very much for the ideas. And I also want to add on that digital diplomacy has another aspect of it, which is diplomacy to the big tech. Because they have already a outsized influence and ability because of the monopoly that they have on many of the services they provide, or in some case, oligopoly, whether it's in communications or whether it's in provision of particular services. So it's having to engage them as also, not in the old way of public-private partnership where there is a big government and a small company, and the small company is helping the big government. That concept is different, and it's especially very stark in Southeast Asia because we are smaller than the big tech companies. So we have a different form of diplomacy that we need to engage in when it comes to discussing this. And there is where I recall back when the GDPR came out, that the market forces that are unleashed because of the importance of the European market made the GDPR much more powerful than just if it were done by way through treaty, but the sheer fact that companies outside the EU that wanted to sell into the EU market had to reorganize their processes in order to match the GDPR. Hence, the impact of the GDPR was really disseminated out as a standard, as a norm, so that it had a great impact in the private sector, which when I was there. So this is another way in which it's a different form of diplomacy to the digital sector that can have a real impact now in AI, because AI companies that want to market into the EU market then have to consider all the regulations that you have. And that can be beneficial for the small countries outside the EU as well.
Thank you very much. And start to think about your questions.
So just a final point on the AI side. I think the general sense that so India is going to be hosting the AI Action Impact Summit that's coming up in a few months. And so there's been a lot of discussions on what should be the focus there. And insofar as I'm plugged into some of these discussions, is to think through how can, not just India, but India as a model for the global south, for other developing countries, what's the normative standards here that you can set when it comes to issues like AI safety, verification, testing? How do you hold some of these models to account? So there are some big questions that are being debated and discussed, which are not happening in the US and China right now, who seem to be on a completely different path in terms of AI development, right? So there's right now this, I think it's a fertile space, the space of thinking through the governance of AI and what some of these powers which lack the capabilities that the major powers have. And again, it has to be on the governance and the standards, the normative side that we can move forward.
Thank you. Sorry, we only have 2 mics. Thank you so much to all of you. We have about 10 minutes for question. We can go a little bit over time, but use your, make the most of this opportunity, because it's not every day you have, so many brains on one stage. Antonio, I see one. Anish, sorry. And Francis. Okay, so let's start with these 3. We can share mics if you want. We have 2.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Antonio Calcara from the Center for Security Diplomacy Strategy. I have a question for all the panelists, and it's about the geopolitical competition that you mentioned in all your remarks, and how this will impact on AI, right? Because we are seeing right now that the United States and China are investing a lot of resources in building basically the entire AI infrastructure, starting from the semiconductors to the data centers to the entire AI stack. So there is a possibility that actually in the future there will be 2 different technospheres with different standards, different components. So my question is, if this, first, if you think that this is a possibility or not, and second, what will be the impact, both in economic and strategic terms, for Europe, for Singapore, and for India? Thanks.
Excellent, great question. Can you pass the mic to Anish?
Hi, thank you very much for this discussion. Yes, so the question I would like to ask is for this EU-Indo-Pacific partnership. Currently there are four countries, right? It's EU, there's Singapore, India, Japan, and South Korea. So, you know, it seems that on bilateral relations, there's a lot going on between the EU and these four countries. But what about the synergy between these four countries itself? So is the EU doing anything to ensure that these four countries are also talking to each other? Like, I know Singapore and India has also a lot going on, but you know, so I think it should be a multilateral association instead of, you know, a bilateral association with EU and these four countries. And also, do you think that this Indo-Pacific partnership could expand to include more countries in the Indo-Pacific? How about, you know, doing it with EU and ASEAN as a multilateral organization? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't want to spoil, but I'm happy to reply to that question. And Francis?
Thank you, Francis Brestra from European Science Institute, National Center for Scientific Research in France, also Grenoble Polytechnic Institute. I have a question about the semiconductor value chain, which is a part of AI, the semiconductor value chain. So in fact, currently, there isn't any country or region which can cover the entire value chain. But China and the US have a will to cover the full value chain for semiconductor in the future. So as it has been mentioned, so there are very big investment in US and China. There are also in Indo-Pacific and Europe. But so looking at the US and China, is 10 times more, in fact, for the next year. And therefore, if we want to, for the other countries, so Indo-Pacific and Europe, if we want to cover this entire value chain, taking into account the turbulent geopolitical situation, the complexity of the value chain, so we need international cooperation, and maybe not with only one country, for example, but with several countries, looking at the very complex and wide value chain. And so maybe a good strategy to look would be to look at the strengths and gaps of each region, Europe, Indo-Pacific, in order to cover the entire value chain with several international cooperation. So my question is, what do you think about this strategy?
Great. Any last question? Sorry, more, and then we can get back to the panel.
Yes, Caterina Bortolazzo, European Digital SME Alliance. I was struck by the reply about diplomacy with big tech. So I think that's a very interesting point to delve into. And also by the first question that has been asked about the two poles, America and China. So, you know, there is more and more talking about European digital sovereignty and European independence from let's say, providers that in many cases don't fully respect the rules, but also the EU sometimes doesn't enforce these rules as much as they can. There are also the DMA and the DSA that we could mention. Indeed, beside the GDPR, the GDPR indeed had a big impact, and everyone is complying with it. But there are many other regulations that we could mention. So my question is, in fact, how would Singapore benefit from a European stack? Is this something of interest for you if this would eventually exist? We are not there yet, but we are talking more and more about it. Thank you.
All right, so we have 4 excellent questions, 4 speakers, and okay, let's say 10 minutes to make it round up. First, 2 competing technospheres along the US-China competition, synergies among digital partnerships, semiconductor value chains. I should specify that Francis is heading the semiconductor cluster at the InPace project, and the big tech diplomacy and your stack. So let's start in the reverse order, if that's okay, because I think Raluca may also have some more questions on the European side. So I'll start with Kartik, then, or Valentina, would you like to start? Or we keep you for the rest? We keep the Europeans for the rest. So let's start with Kartik, then Ben, then Raluca, and then Valentina to have a little bit more time to think about the question.
So those are very easy questions. I just
Yeah,
no. So the techno block sphere is one I've been thinking a lot about. That's still because I focus on India's tech policy and strategy, and I think if you asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have said India is comfortable with the US stack, right? I think right now, I don't think that's a confident statement I can make, given how things have gone the last 8 months. And if you've seen anything, like a big focus on India's diplomacy has also been hedging against the United States, right? I mean, all the with the BRICS, the kind of thawing with China, the growing partnership with Europe, the increasing tech focus in Singapore, Southeast Asia as well. So it's trying to find other partners through which it can hedge against the US and China now, right? And it has a stack. The India stack does exist, but it exists for a very specific purpose and a function, which is largely for payments and financial inclusion. And there's a lot of development-focused operations and tasks that the India stack can do, but not beyond that, right? And the India stack is still dependent on a lot of these big tech companies to function, right? Whether it's Microsoft, NVIDIA, Amazon, India is still reliant, and it will continue to be reliant. I think right now it's okay being reliant on them as it builds its own sovereign capabilities in some of these areas, right? The China question is much more difficult. I think, given the security implications involved, there is no desire, interest, impetus to engage digitally, technologically with China on any level. Even, DeepSeek, if you go ask anybody working for the government in India, there is tremendous amount of consternation on how it's being used and applied in India, right? And so India, in that sense, will be comfortable with the US-centric tech ecosystem, a US tech stack, until it can build its own capabilities for the foreseeable future with all these other partners with whom it's building up its relationship. The other question I wanted to kind of respond to was the kind of networked question, right? So the interesting thing about India is you kind of map out its tech partnerships, that it has a tech partnership with the the TTC. It has a growing technology relationship with Singapore, although there's no formalized dialogue or a mechanism. There's a lot of discussions on space, semiconductors, things that Singapore has been doing really well, AI as well in some areas. Japan and South Korea, there has been a lot of technology-focused discussions on things like 5G, 6G, semiconductors. So all these dialogues are independent, right? Now there is scope to stitch together specific kind of projects on which all these different mechanisms converge. That could be data spaces. One promising area is cybersecurity. Can you create a kind of a threat or a threat sharing platform between these countries through which they coordinate and they share the kind of attacks and other kinds of threats they're facing online, which is what the Quad has been doing for the last 3-4 years, right? There's a cybersecurity mechanism there through which all the Quad partners are engaging on what the kind of cyber threats and risks that they're facing. So that's another area. So there, I mean, it requires some leadership. I don't know where it's going to come from, but there is space in which you can actually create some joint area of cooperation if you think hard enough.
Karthik, I really like the idea of the cybersecurity cooperation because I was originally thinking of cooperation on legislation or regulation, and I can't imagine that between ASEAN and the EU in the near future. I mean, not even for ASEAN, within ASEAN itself, to agree on regulation in the near future. I think with more like-minded countries like Malaysia, we might be able to, but not as a whole. But cybersecurity, I think if the AP CERT or the ASEAN CERT can collaborate with the EU CERT and be able to share trade information, I think there's a lot of potential there. So now, for the other questions, I think they're actually interrelated because the question about technology bifurcation, right, that's the thing, US stack, China stack. My view is a bit contrary because I think of the time when I was in the private sector doing tech management and before the Y2K. I know it's, millions of years ago, Y2K. Business continuity planning relies a lot, the resilience relies a lot on having the diversity and redundancy. And in that sense, if we have a diverse tech stacks, there's actually opportunities to hedge one against the other, rather than depend on one tech stack alone. Because if we are all dependent on, let's say, the Microsoft stack, if anything should happen to Microsoft, or Microsoft should change hands, or if we're all reliant on the Alibaba stack, then if something should happen with Alibaba's, that is a risk. So in fact, I see the technology fragmentation as an opportunity for those of us who are able to have that interconnectivity. And also for the supply chains, even for the semiconductor supply chain, that if there's diversity of the supply chain, there is some resilience that we can create if there are options and backups. And the more countries are able to contribute to the supply chain, the less dependent we become. So again, so in that sense, how would Singapore benefit from an EU stack? I think that would be great because that would be yet another stack that is, I would say, probably relatively dependable, even when it does arrive, that we could have as a backup, as a resilience measure for the safety of our systems.
Brilliant. Yeah, fully agree. Raluca? Already some of the points were raised, but I want to pick up on the cybersecurity angle, especially when it comes to cooperation. The EU recently also published another regulation, which I think is very interesting, is the Cybersecurity Solidarity Act. And I think when it comes to also matching the AI, for instance, or data analytics and cyber nexus, there is a lot to learn there, especially when it comes to situational awareness, information sharing, and also creating this cyber security shield, especially against certain disruptions. So I see a lot of potential there also in engaging with the private sector as well in terms of information sharing and capacity building. So I would also identify, for instance, cybersecurity, and there is a lot of, again, work done under cyber, more broadly, cyber capacity building, as well as cyber norms promotion for that matter. So yes, I identify this as a priority, but then I really like the question about the geopolitics and also the Eurostack, and in a way it links as well to advanced semiconductors, because I would argue that geopolitics around the stack or around new technologies is kind of now driven by several axes. We have heard how important infrastructure is, compute as well, cloud infrastructure. We have forgot sometimes also about populism and kind of the shifts in politics and domestic politics that can impact workforce. Then we are very much dependent indeed on disruptions in security supply chains, but also critical rare earths and minerals. I look at it more holistically here. And then I would even add to this as well energy dependencies when it comes to training the latest AI models. And there are other things as well that play such an important role. Another thing that I cannot ignore when I talk about geopolitics and techno-industrial blocks, as Antonio actually mentioned, is the defense and deterrence angle. Because once you buy into, and nowadays, tech stack, you also buy into new dependencies. And I highly, highly agree with this approach of hedging and diversifying suppliers and technologies, because then it provides you with certain levers to navigate these types of dependencies. We have seen how much buying into defense dependencies makes your national security and priority sovereignty, at the end of the day, vulnerable to these. And maybe a last point here, I think that standardization as well, tech standardization, might also contribute to further maybe fragmentation between these blocks, and we need to pay attention to these areas as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Raluca. Valentina, your last.
So I think it's very difficult. The time is really difficult. So it's, you said 6 months ago you would answer differently. And I hope that in 6 months we can answer also differently and for better. However, I think we cannot have European system independent from United States or from China. We have to have interoperability, and I said I'm coming from CEA. We have offices in the United States. We have the offices in Japan, and we work for collaborations. We have also some European technologies which are sovereign, like we have ASML, and we count on that. It remains in Europe, and we still keep competitiveness. That was why I said we have this AI strategy. But we don't want to be isolated. We have to work together.
Wise words for the end. Thank you very much, Valentina. It's been a very long day, so I will not try to summarize what's been said. Anish, we can talk about your question afterwards, but I think some of us have already alluded to it. I think the important is, some of the key issues is starting small, start with a specific topic that really can bring us all together. In this sense, cybersecurity could be one of them. Projects like in PACE, and I'll do a little bit of publicizing here because it's also why we're here, are specifically designed as a hub, right? So if you actually go to that website, you see it designed as a hub precisely to connect those bilateral partnerships and to create synergies between the individual partner countries, right? So they're open to all of you. They're open to SMEs, students, research organizations, industry, etc. And it is about this networking capacity. It may be on the project level, but of course the idea is there. So you're pretty much spot on. We're already over time. I know that there is a reception and food waiting for you outside, which is already difficult to kind of fight against. So I would like you to join me in thanking the speakers. I think this was a brilliant discussion. I'm glad we actually have more time because we have all day tomorrow, and tomorrow morning, those who are interested in these more specifically policy domains can join our closed-door discussion. So please join me in thanking our speakers, and then I'll handle the floor to our magnificent guests afterwards.
Let's move on to our last session. I'm delighted to invite Ms. Svetlana Kolesova to offer her closing thoughts.
Thank you very much. Well, it's not really, I don't want to stand in between, now and reception, okay? But I wanted to say a few words here about the session, okay? So it's actually, yeah. So, and also maybe a bit of, initiate some thinking, reflection before the day of tomorrow, okay? So first of all, well, here the title of the session is indeed Connecting Digital Partnership in the Pacific. And the good news is that in 1.5 years, we will have in PACE closing event in Brussels around this topic. Okay? So connecting digital partnerships, like somewhere in spring 2027, we have time. Okay, that's a good news. The less good news is that we need to think, well, it's a good news still, yeah. We need to think to fill it with a good content, right? And it's maybe not necessarily about Indo-Pacific, because Canada has also a digital partnership agreement with Europe, so maybe other countries will be inspired, you know, US has TTC, you know, like India has TTC and so on. So maybe it will be great if also during the discussion you keep this in mind, and maybe an idea will emerge what can be done, you know, like what concretely can be done to help in the connection of Indo-Pacific digital partnerships. And maybe we can prepare this by doing, we will have activities in India, in South Korea. So maybe we can start to prepare and think about this. Okay, that's thing number one, okay? Because we want to shape it to be helpful for connecting digital partnerships. So, but what exactly needs to be connected, you see? So, yeah. Okay, then second thing, and just very brief, yes, maybe also for tomorrow. Valentina, you mentioned here that indeed it starts from, you know, step by step, small, and you mentioned AI Institute in India, which is great, and we have here partners who worked on this very hardly. But you know, in PACE has an opportunity, a possibility actually to support, to drive some elements forward. Not everything, but some. We have pilot projects, okay? We have pilot projects, and it's perfectly, well, of course, it's always, like we say, competing interests, because if there are 10 pilot projects, it's not possible, okay? But it's perfectly possible that this institute propose a pilot project with European organizations, with companies, you know, like, and then we will discuss, and maybe it will be done, you know, like in PACE. We are not giving money, that's important, but we are doing many other things. And you will see tomorrow, I'll have a presentation about funding. You will see that there are other things, not only about funding, yes, which are clearly integrated there. Okay, so what I mean is that tomorrow when you discuss, if you can also think what concretely could help in your domain, you know, something very small scale level, like some pilot testing, you know, pilot collaboration, ideathon, hackathon, you know, whatever, you know, anything, including this Indian Institute. That's totally fine, but then share this, and we need to know this. And we still have time to maybe to integrate this in our rolling plan until the end of the project. So you see, this is what I meant in my opening. It's not about discussion, it's that also it enters in the, you know, like, could enter in the future elements, yeah, in the future work. And just last thing, you know, like, I heard about, yes, of course, when we started in PACE, I actually had a very clear idea that TTC is really about geopolitical technology issues, export control, you know, like semiconductor supply chain and other things, right? Okay. And the digital partnership, it's really for digital standard, market access, and so on. But, and I actually originally thought that TTC operates at a very strategic security level and digital partnership much more on operational level. But you know, I'm now involved in the work with Trade and Technology Council in India with Working Group 1. On the separate things, nothing related to InPace, and my colleagues are involved, okay. We are working to support this working group. And I only see, and it's not a secret, it's published, yeah, only practical and operational dimension. We are asked to do, you know, like hackathon, ideathon, my colleague is leading like hackathon, ideathon on something specific, and it's all announced by the Indian government, you know, like, so all the months now, before, like 2 years ago, it was on regulations. But now I really see practical things, like different events, workshops, study visit on battery technologies, you know, really operational things. So my question is, and maybe we need to think about this later, so I really see this switch not from like academic side, but more from practitioner side. Nothing comes in terms of since a year, nothing comes or more high level. Maybe it was done already. I don't know. No, I'm kidding. Yes, but okay. Please think again what could be done operationally, help it with InPace to help TTC2 in India, okay, TTC working group 2, okay, in this case, this is working group 1, we are working with working group 2. Yeah, anyway, non-digital dialogue. So what can we do in InPace to support TTC in India and other digital partnerships with something concrete, with pilot projects, ideathon, hackathon, and whatever else, which will give concrete benefits to the digital partnerships. Thank you very much. So think about this tomorrow, okay? We will not be able to do everything. I don't want to promise, but at least we need to know your idea. Thank you.
Let's invite Professor Ge to offer his closing remarks.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you so much, Lena. And really, it has been a big day. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much for our grand opening with His Excellencies and your dictionary dignitaries and with your vision and enthusiasm. I would like to thank all our speakers, panelists, and participants for contributing to such rich and engaging exchanges. This conference has shown that the future of the digital world depends not only on our technology, but on our trust and collaboration and shared purpose. Our biggest adversary, not you, me, people. Our biggest adversary is AI. AI that brings in. So I think don't miss the main point. I know sometimes your friend deserted you, but actually maybe your enemy saved you. And with that, I thank you all once again for your presence and your insight, and looking forward for your continued contribution tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Professor Ge. And now, we invite everyone to stay for our reception just outside the auditorium. After that, you are free to explore in US, Singapore, the wonderful nightlife, the night safari, and the delicious food with your friends and dream partner. Thank you all for joining us. We wish you a wonderful evening and a bright digital future ahead. Thank you.